In today's lesson, we're going to look at both 1-8 and 1-9. So 1-8, Chapter 1, Lesson 8, Roots. Let's begin on page 77, the next right-hand side page. And as we begin with roots, first off, this right here, a lot of people call the square root symbol. It's actually called a radical. So this right here, where it's a square root, is a radical. The square root is one of two equal factors. Or in other words, you can ask yourself what number times itself. So, square root of 25 is 5 because 5 times 5 is 25. The 5 is one of two equal factors, or if you ask yourself what number times itself, 5 times itself is 25. The answer is also -5 because a negative times a negative is still a positive. So it actually has two different answers, a positive and a -5. You cannot, it's really important to note this before we move on, you cannot take the square root of a negative number. So if your negative is under the radical sign, this is not possible. No number times itself equals a negative. It does not exist. It is not real. So remember, back from the first lesson of this chapter, everything that we're looking at are real numbers, and this is not real. So let's continue on. The square root is the opposite of squaring. So square root of 25 is 5, and squaring it, this is 5 squared, we get 25 because 5 times 5 is 25. Notice that these are opposites and they undo each other. If you started with the number 25 and you take the square root, you get 5. But then if you take that 5 and you square it, you get back to 25. They undo each other. They are opposites. Perfect squares are the squares of integers. So remember, integers are whole numbers and they're opposites. Perfect squares are the squares of them. So it doesn't matter if it's 5 squared or -5 squared. A perfect square, for example, would be 25. Here are some more examples. Let's look at how we got them. 1 squared, or 1 times 1, is 1. 2 squared, or 2 times 2 is 4. 3 squared is 9. 4 squared is 16, and so on. So let's look at some examples here, things that might come up. What is the square root of 64? Or in other words, what times itself is 64? It's 8. 8 times 8 is 64, but it's also -8. Because remember from above, a negative times a negative is a positive. So how can we write this in a simpler way? We can write it like this, plus or minus 8. This says a positive 8 and a -8. What is the square root of 16 over 25? Let's look at example B here. In this example, notice that the entire fraction is under the radical. If the entire fraction is under the radical, then you can take the square root of the numerator and denominator separately. The square root of 16 is 4, and the square root of 25 is 5. So again, if the entire fraction is under the radical, you can take the square root of the numerator and denominator separately. Let's look at solving an equation. If we had the problem x squared equals 144, remember the goal is to isolate the variable, get the variable x all by itself. So in doing that, the inverse or opposite of squaring is square root. I would have to take the square root of both sides. Remember, they are inverse, they are opposite, they undo each other. so I just get x. And the square root of 144 is plus or minus 12 because positive 12 times positive 12 and also negative 12 times negative 12 both equal 144. So those are square roots. Let's continue on with cube root. So square root is one of two equal factors. Cube root is one of three equal factors, or what times itself 3 times. Notice it is the same radical symbol, but with a little 3 to the side. Perfect cubes are the number times itself 3 times. So 1 times 1 times 1, or 1. 2 times 2 times 2, or 8. 3 times 3 times 3, or 27, and so on. I can continue going on. Let's look at some examples. Example D, the cubed root of 64. So in other words, what number times itself equals 64? Well, that was the number that I was going to go to next. We know that it is 4 because 4 times 4 times 4 is equal to 64. One more example. What is the cubed root of negative 8? What number times itself 3 times will give you a negative? Well, I know it's got to be a negative number because I know that a negative times a negative times a negative is a negative. Remember, we discussed if it's an odd number of times being multiplied, it would be negative. So I know it's negative 2 because negative 2 times negative 2 times negative 2 is negative 8. It's important to note that you can have the cubed root of a negative number, but you can never have the square root of a negative number. Because in a square root, you're only multiplying the number times itself. And in a cubed root, you're multiplying that factor 3 times.